right, thank you very much. So I'm very excited. This is called, I haven't quite decided what this is called, something like Passing on Passmore. So based on our Passmore podcast with Dean Evans, I'm sort of asking interesting people their thoughts, future thoughts, what inspires them, and then future thoughts of what they think would be really interesting going forwards, dreaming big at our present time in our culture. So this is quite funny because the person I've asked is my brother. It's easier to get hold of your family than other people. So welcome, Mark.
Well, thank you, Jo.
And I actually Googled you last night to try and get some information. That was quite funny. So I Googled you on Wikiperson or something. That's an interesting one. Have you seen yourself on Wikiperson?
I haven't, no.
Okay, well, you've got a good string of things that you've done. So you're an interesting,
okay, oh, great.
Yeah, filmmaker, cinematographer. You've got an Emmy recently, haven't you? Do you want to tell us what your recent Emmy was for, just to place you?
Yeah, well, I basically, I grew up in Cornwall, started filming underwater with Vicky, my partner, in the Fowl, and from there we essentially we moved to doing sequence work for companies like the BBC, and then came out to Africa, where I am now, speaking from Kenya, to work for a filmmaker called Alan Root, and he was very much our mentor. And so we've basically developed over the years. And our most recent film is something called The Elephant and the Termite, and the Emmy you referred to was for writing, which was lovely to get for a wildlife film. So we were very chuffed about that.
And I'm very excited when you get those things. You got one for cinematography for The Elephant Queen as well, didn't you? That was exciting.
I mean, the films have done well over the years, so and it's lovely to have them recognised like that, because they take us. Our films are not quick things to make. They probably take us anywhere from 2 to 10 years to create.
Exciting, isn't it? And I've actually been out to see one of them. It's very lovely. So thank you ever so much. So I have a couple of questions really to sort of situate you, and we sort of situated you as who you are. And the other thing was, so these are more getting down to the grist of it, which is what inspires you? That's my first question.
I mean, I think it all started basically looking in rock pools on Gilling Bay's beach, and just seeing something which was such a different world as a sort of 3 or 4-year-old, looking into the depths, seeing all the little blennies and gobies and prawns nipping around, and then trying to catch them and take them home and maintain them in jam jars, which always ended in tears. But I think that was really was what got me started. And that intrigue and wonder at the natural world has never really left. And so wherever I am, I feel very privileged actually as a naturalist, because there's always something that I can find interest in, and I find it intriguing. Whether it's down in a rock pool, on the Cornish coast, or whether it's in Tsavo National Park in Kenya. And especially it's the little stories that I find interesting. I mean, you've got the big charismatic megafauna, but for me, really, it's more about the ecology and the connections of those animals within ecosystems. And it's trying to unravel those little stories, which I find absolutely enthralling.
Brilliant. Yeah, so I remember, and I always say to people, it's like I used to love going for a walk with you, because you'd find something everywhere you are. You'd sort of find a little something, and it's a glorious thing.
Yeah, that still happens. I mean, for example, if you're in the Masai Mara, which is a protected area on the Tanzanian border in Kenya, there's an antelope called the topi, and in the breeding season, the male topi carve out little territories, and then what they do is, so you'll have an area of grassland with tiny little territories, and the topi will be standing proud on termite mounds or any raised area, and they have what's called a lek system. And what happens is the females come along and they look to find the best males, and those are the ones which can defend their little area the best. And so it's female choice. They'll actually come through the lek and decide who to mate with. And this is going on in Kenya, in the Masai Mara. But for example, there was a time last year when I was down on the rocks by Gona's Head, and I glanced down and there were a lot of flies. They were very similar to a kelp fly on the rocks in the sunshine. And they were doing essentially exactly the same thing as these mammals in East Africa. The tiny little male flies, which probably weren't more than 8 or 10 millimeters long, and they all had these little territories. I mean, some of them were no more than a couple of centimeters wide, and they were all displaying to the females. And then if the female tried to come through them to get to one of the males would jump on each other and fight, and then she'd eventually pick the one she chose and they'd go off and mate. And I had no idea that this system occurred. You know, I know it occurs in birds, I know about the mammals from the Mara, but I had no idea this occurred in insects. I think it's just an example of the little things you see which are completely intriguing and really, really quite wonderful. And as a naturalist, keep you going.
Oh, brilliant. Yes, well, I was talking to Toby in Shallal yesterday, and he was talking to me about patterns. We were talking about ecosystems and villages, ecological village, sort of architecture and design. And then he went into this whole thing of pattern, which is, I haven't really got my head around it, but it's fascinating. But it's the same sort of thing, isn't it, of pattern, that those patterns in nature, you see those similar things happening again. Yeah.
And I think part of it is trying to be in a position or in a headspace where you can recognize it, because we all live such fast lives these days that you could, I could have easily just been wandering up on the rocks with my head full of something else, the next call I had to make or whatever it was. But it's being in the right headspace to have the time to look and kind of and observe and then make the links.
I think so. So that thing of sitting and watching, isn't it? And so we were talking before we started about ecosystems, and I'm just very aware, I feel, that we don't sometimes really understand. We want to sort out one problem and we go and sort out that problem, but we don't understand how that affects everything else. So although one thing might be solved, it actually has made lots of problems elsewhere, and that we need to have that. Almost, the other day I was thinking about something like called looking around, where you actually just stop and look around you, and a bit like the donut economics idea, look at all the different things that are influencing it. What's the weather like on the day that you go? What else is happening? What happens to those little flies afterwards? Who eats them? All those other sort of
absolutely, yeah. And it's, funnily enough, it only happens on a sunny day. It had to be calm, had not too much wind, otherwise the flies get blown around. And what was really interesting was that I'd seen it 2 or 3 times before, and it always happens in the same place. So it always happens in that same little flat area of rock, in an area of hundreds of square meters of granite. And that's the intriguing thing. And I think, for me, it's about the connections, and I think that's what we try to show in our films. And it's about showing but not telling. So we made a film called The Queen of Trees, which was about really the relationship between a tiny fig wasp, which is no more than a couple of millimeters long, and a big fig tree, and how they basically, one depends on the other. And the fig wasp is an obligate pollinator of the fig tree. And if you then ramify out, the fig trees themselves are really important to the rest of Africa's larger animals, because they produce figs and everything comes in and eats them. But it's not that they do that, it's that they do that all through the year. So a lot of trees will fruit once a year in the wet season, say, and they'll provide an incredible bounty of fruit. But the thing about the fig trees is that they'll probably fruit 3 or 4 times a year, but you can never predict when it's going to happen. And that's great because it sustains this population of fruit-eating animals throughout the dry season when everything gets very hard for them.
And that's a really interesting one as well, isn't it? I think that thing of showing people rather than telling, because if we feel like we're being told something, I don't know, I'm sort of a bit of a reactive education person. It's like, but if somebody shows you something, then you can engage and make your own connection.
I think that's so important, because if you show somebody something, they have their own experience, and in a way, it's almost like they come to that realization by themselves. And if you have that, then I think that can stay with you your whole life. Whereas if you're told something, then it comes, often it goes in one ear out the other.
And sometimes it's almost telling is like a task, isn't it? I've done the task, it's gone, it's sort of shelved. And so sorry, go on.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the fig film, we never, in that whole film, which lasts a 15-minute film, we never talk about connections. but we are constantly showing them. So, if somebody comes to us, later over the years, people said, oh yeah, I love all the connections. And you say, well, actually, we never talked about it. All we did was just show them. And I think that is the power of your own coming to your own realization.
Well, so going back to our dear Passmore Edwards, he said, fund the ladder and the poor will climb it themselves. So it's the same sort of thing in the ways, give people what they need and then they'll find, give the information and people will find the way to go through it. And I'm going to talk to someone later on who's involved with the Extinction Rebellion, and that's these citizens' assemblies, tell people, give them the information. So so that sort of says, in a way, what inspires you and what you're doing, because you're constantly being a naturalist wherever we drop you, really. And I remember the I remember the frogs in the pockets, and I've enjoyed the whole lot of it. I've had a wonderful time with you, especially as a child and a teenager with all of that, and even later on with guinea fowl and things. So what would you, going forwards with that then, what do you feel like if you could fund things in the future? I've been saying to people I'd give them about $1 billion, but what do you think we need to do now? Where would you put that from your experience and your understanding? What would you do?
I think there are obviously so many areas that need funding. I personally, because of my training and what I do, I think that we are in a biodiversity crisis at the moment. We're just losing species, year in, year out, all throughout the world. Whether it's in tropical rainforest, whether it's in the Cornish flower meadow, or beneath the sea, we're losing species. And everybody says, well, what does that matter? Does biodiversity matter? And it does, because the more biodiverse a system is, the more resilient it is, and resilient to change. And we're obviously coming up to a period where there are going to be huge changes, and we're already seeing them. Here in East Africa, I'm talking to you from the Kenyan coast, and there hasn't been a good harvest. Well, it hasn't been a harvest now for 3 years. And so people are, every year it rains a little bit. They go out, they plant maize, and it grows, and it gets to probably 3 or 4 feet high. It flowers, and then generally it stops raining. And within days, the soil is too dry to sustain growth, and the crop fails. So we're in the 3rd year of that now. We're now in a La Nina year, and it's getting worse. And if you go up north in Kenya, now we're having. It really is a very serious situation. You've got the cattle and the flocks are dying. People are utterly desperate. And the wildlife is dying alongside the flocks. So, and this, I can remember we filmed for the Elephant Queen, which was the film we did for, which Apple then took. We filmed elephants dying in Amboseli in 2009-10. At that stage, everybody said, well, this is a 50-year drought. And now we're 12 years on, and we've got the same. So 50-year drought is now a 12-year drought, and maybe in 5 years' time we're going to get the same. So these things these things are becoming more and more regular, and as climate change really kicks in, it's like maybe there'll be 2 or 3 years, and so it's incredibly desperate. And you think, well, how can you say you had £1 billion, would that make any difference? What you can do, you can,
I know,
you can try, there's the acute problem, which is people just needing food, and obviously you can feed people, you can do school meals and that will get them. But the bigger problem is the fact that a lot of people, their bank, as it were, is in their livestock herds. So you've got these herds of goats and cattle, and people are pastoralists up in the north, so they move them around, and traditionally they move them from one spot to the next wherever it rains, and you might take them 50 miles, 100 miles across the next mountain into an area where it's rained. But now, now it doesn't work like that. If it doesn't rain at all anywhere, you've got big herds of livestock, and they're dying. So it's a question: how do you? Can you help people like that? What is it that you can do? Because that is their back, that is their money. And the more cattle you have, the richer you are. And it becomes maybe you move from using them for meat to dairy, but that's a whole different mindset, and people have to make that transition by themselves. You can't tell people what to do. That's not for us to be doing anyway. It's about how can you help them make that transition, if they decide for themselves that's what they want to do.
And so, I think it's really important, isn't it? It's resilience. It's that a lot of us are going to have to change practices, what we do. Yeah. And so it's how do we support each other to change in a positive way? And so how do you have, like, you sit down maybe with a lot of people and you say, like, this is happening, it's not working. What could work for us as a community? I'm not presuming to understand the communities, I'm looking at, I was listening to something the other day about rewilding, that we could almost feed ourselves in Britain if we rewilded a lot of our agricultural land. And someone had actually done a survey up in Scotland and gone round to farmers and said, if you had compensation, would you rewild? And 60% said they would. So then you're talking about your biodiversity, aren't you? It's trying to sustain your biodiversity, having resilience,
and creating food at the same time. And we have to change our ways. There's no two ways about it. If we want to, live sustainably, then we all have to eat less meat. We have to eat more plant protein. We have to grow it ourselves. We can't be importing soya from the rainforests which have been cut down in the rest of the world, purely because we're vegetarian. We have to be eating locally, growing locally, and I think that's the big challenge. And I mean, for me, there is no such thing as sustainable growth. We live on a finite planet. We've got finite resources. Growth is not sustainable. We have to live within our means. And it was the other day I was thinking about it. I was thinking, well, ever since the Industrial Revolution, although there's been a very long lag period. We are now, we're only now experiencing the full effect, and it's going to get worse, of what we started. Yes. And when you think about it, in taking fossil fuels out of the ground, whether it's oil, coal, or gas, we are essentially burning the forest growth that's happened on this planet over millions of years, and we're burning that in a condensed form in 200 or 300 years. And it's naive to think there's not going to be huge repercussions, And I was, the whole idea of trying to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, already the latest UN report was that we're going to overshoot that. Maybe it'll be 2.8, maybe it'll be 2.4. But these have enormous repercussions throughout the world. And some people say, perhaps naively, it'll be quite nice, it'll be a bit warmer. But it might be a bit warmer for a few years, and it might be a bit wetter. But if the North Atlantic current fails, and it's getting weaker and weaker, then we're in completely uncharted waters.
I watched something the other day, and I'd always sort of understand this thing about temperature change, but I didn't understand it until I heard about the Atlantic. Someone has sort of mentioned that to me before, and it was like, you're not going to move your weather. I was like, okay, I really get that. If our weather doesn't move, because that's one of the reasons they had the fires in Canada and everything, if the weather doesn't move, you get a hot spot and it stays hot. It doesn't move on in a few days like it used to, that terrible high pressure. It just keeps going. Yes, I mean, it's really drastic, isn't it? And
it is. So going back to your question.
That's not very in depth, is it? It's just drastic.
I did diverge a bit. I think.
I'm pleased. Thank you. I think it's important.
It's about how do you maintain biodiversity. So we're obviously going to go through a hard time, but if we lose species, if a species goes extinct, then that's forever, and we're not going to get it back. So the question is, how do you maintain biodiversity where hopefully human ingenuity comes up with some, just something to help us in the meantime. But for me, we have to maintain biodiversity. So that does mean rewilding. Yes. It means in somewhere like East Africa here, we've got amazing national parks. It's quite different to European national parks. They are for wildlife. They're not for cottages and villages.
They're not for us all tramping over for a nice dog walk on a Sunday and a picnic.
Exactly, on a you know, in a landscape that has been denuded of its trees over hundreds of years and is now a monoculture of grass and sheep. You know, we're not so our national parks are incredibly important here, and we've got, you know, there's been a big move to try and create corridors between them, because, you know, we obviously, population pressure is huge, and it's only increasing. So the idea is you have these sort of hotspots of national parks, of biodiversity, and you try and create corridors so that you get at least genetic flow from one to the other. Now, whether that's going to be possible or not, I don't know. But ultimately, fundamentally, we have to try and save those ecosystems. Whether they're connected, I don't know. It may be that in some instances we're too late, because only then, once we've got our situation under control, do we have the resource to allow us to then expand it, hopefully, and those species are still there and they can make connections again. So for me, it's all about maintaining biodiversity and what we can do to help that. You know, that may be, you know, creating a patch in your garden where you grow wildflowers. I mean, that every little bit helps.
Yes.
Yeah, and as a conservationist, you do live in a world of pain sometimes.
I know.
But also there are some really good things happening. And I can remember being on the cliffs and walking up the cliffs one day, and it's down in West Penwith, and having a flock of choughs fly overhead calling. I looked out to sea, and there were bluefin tuna breaching in the tide race. So I thought, okay, you know, a lot of the world is having huge problems, but there are little areas of hope. And I think, you know, that the Cornish Chough project is one. You know, I sincerely hope with tuna that we don't start fishing again, and we don't assign ourselves a quota, because, you know, they are such an important predator. And we don't really, you know, it's a bit like sharks on tropical reefs. We don't understand yet. We're just getting a glimpse of how important they are. You know, and sharks are absolutely essential for the health of the tropical reef. You know, partly because they keep other predators under control, which would eat the fish, and that make the sand for the, you know. So it's just one connection from one, you know, all the way down the layer. And, you know, if we take out a layer of the trophic layer, which we can do if we start destroying sharks, then we're in completely uncharted waters again. So my biggest thing is, even though it's hard sometimes to make the connections, is that we have to try and maintain biodiversity at all costs.
Yes.
Knowing that we're going to go through a sort of a pretty rocky period in the next few decades, but at least we've then got it to help when we need it.
I think eco corridors is really exciting, and I think one of the reasons I wanted to talk about people is like, what would one do, is you see these sort of solo things happening, but you need lots of them, don't you? And there's somewhere in America where I think they've actually made an eco corridor over a bypass, over a highway. So they've put this beautiful wide sweep so the animals can actually go across, because all our roads just cut off, don't they? And I remember going and just planting some trees once on something, and they were making a corridor in Cornwall between the cliffs to the woods, so that along the side of a field you just grow some trees, you put a little track, so wildlife can actually get across, can go down that corridor and keep those habitats communicating. Biodiversity is crucial, isn't it? It's absolutely crucial, from insect to large mammals, the whole lot, the whole ecosystem. And yes, I was very excited. So there's something called Falmouth Food Co-op, and that's all about local sustainable food, you know, supporting local growers. It's fantastic. And they've also got Loveland, this area of land. I need to talk to someone from there, really. And they were growing these grains. So there's a grain that's very resilient to Cornwall, and it used to be grown over 150 years ago, and they've got it out of a seed bank and they're growing it. And I always forget its name, but I'm so excited by this little grain.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, the thing is, we have to grow locally. You know, we've got to try and, you know, limit the food miles. You know, I mean, to be eating strawberries, pretty tasteless strawberries in February is ultimately unsustainable.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it's got to go back to producing locally, and that provides jobs, and that's what we need. We've got to have local jobs, local production, and we can't expect to have the variety necessarily in the future that we have today.
But you have better taste, don't you? And it's seeing
yeah,
that, and like you're saying, it's seeing that whole circle, that then you have local jobs, then you have more local community, then you have more people connected, then you're more interested in supporting each other. It's a bigger picture, isn't it? It's small. It starts, people go like, oh, it's a bit small, but it's not small, it's a bigger picture. And then
ultimately that builds, sorry to interrupt, but ultimately that builds community.
Yes.
And that's what we need more than anything else at the moment.
And then, we can still look after each other, and we can still send surplus and care for people at distance who don't have so much and everything. It's not that you just become a small world that is very inward looking, but you have to have your home looking safe, don't you? You have to be able to do all that. Yes, thank you. Biodiversity.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge challenge, but I mean, going back to something like, if you go back to the story of the fig tree, which is obviously, we put a lot of research into that. Something like a fig wasp. Now, a fig wasp, if that fig wasp just happened to if just say a 2-degree temperature rise totally affected that fig wasp, and it was no longer able to pollinate, say its behavior changed or something, then that tiny, there's something which nobody would have thought about. But ultimately, the repercussions of that, all over tropical Africa and all over, in fact, all over the tropics where fig trees grow. And we're talking about sort of wild fig trees here, which there are hundreds and hundreds of different species, but they all have their obligate pollinator fig wasp. Now, if a 2-degree temperature rise, say, killed that wasp or altered its behavior or made it less efficient at pollinating, the ramifications of that would reverberate all through the ecosystem. And my concern is there are a lot of these little things that would tip that we have no knowledge of, and it's not until they do tip that we're suddenly aware of them, and then it's crisis control.
We were on something a while ago, and it is an emergency, and we should be dealing with it like we would if we were in a war zone, and we're not. We're just not putting all our reserves and all our intelligence and all our funding into sorting this out, because there's no glory at the end of it. No one's going to go whoopee. They're just going to go, thank God we're continuing. It's not good. You're not going to get.
And it could have been much worse.
Yes.
But the thing is,
which is so important.
At the same time, you've got the politicians clamoring for growth. And I think the two, I don't see how the two ultimately are compatible. We have to live in a society which sustains itself. We can't be constantly on growth. And sustaining itself brings its own rewards. It's not about stuff.
No, it's not about stuff, is it? It's a lot about community and quality of life, which people
and human relationships and exactly, quality of life.
And being able to actually sit down and watch nature and see that sort of plethora, that abundance of beauty and interconnectedness, which we all just need to pause.
You don't have to be in tropical Africa to see that. I mean, there's a very successful film recently, and I'd urge a lot of people, I urge everyone to see it, called My Garden of 1,000 Bees, which has won a lot of major awards all around the world. And this is a film about a cameraman in lockdown who has a garden in Bristol, and it's about what he did in lockdown. And it's this beautiful film about bees, and not about honeybees, but about all the various little sort of solitary pollinators and that live in this cameraman's, it's called Martin Dawn, that live in his garden. And it's a beautiful, charming film, and it's made in somebody's garden.
Yes.
And it's not even a big wild space. And so we can get huge enjoyment and satisfaction from what's right outside where we live.
Yes. Oh, thank you ever so much. I think we've done well.
Great. Well, it's been fascinating. I had no idea where we were going to go in this.
I know. Well, it's really exciting, isn't it? We did say at the beginning, are there any other questions? Is there anything else like you'd like to add? I mean, I suppose.
Okay. There's one thing I think it's about no-take zones, fishing no-take zones, and our fisheries. I mean, we stagger on from overexploiting one species to overexploiting the next, and that's been going on for decades now. But I can remember as a student going to a Marine Conservation Society meeting, and there was somebody, and I forget his name, but he was a researcher from New Zealand, and he'd come over to talk about no-take zones and how effective they were.
Right.
Sorry, can you hear that? Is the traffic too loud?
No, do you know, it's brilliant on Zoom. You don't hear much apart from this.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so sorry. So I'll continue. And so he talked to the conference about no-take zones and how effective they were. And essentially, it's about creating a park, or whatever you call it, an area where there's absolutely no fishing, there's no extraction whatsoever, and allowing those areas to flourish and police them well, and which then sort of feeds and seeds the ocean around it, which actually increases fish stocks. And to me, then I thought, actually, this is a no-brainer. And I was 17 or 18 at the time, and here we are now, and we are 40 odd years later, and still in the UK we haven't got our act together with no-take zones. And still you've got marine protected areas, and you've got trawling and dredging in 90% of them. So it's like, we can't rely on politicians to do these things. We have to, individually, because politicians, it's all about short-term thinking, and these are long-term. These are things which are decades or centuries or even millennia in how we have to approach them. And I think what I've learned is that we have to do them ourselves. We have to, as communities and groups, because we can't rely on the politicians. They don't care. They just, most of them care about that being re-elected for 4 or 5 years later.
I know I might have to take this bit out, but I just want to write. I can't remember the name of our Prime Minister, but I'm so disappointed. I just want to send him a postcard saying, shame on you for not going to COP. Shame on you for not getting yourself there. Yeah,
but the Prime Minister's changed. It's now Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, I can't say his name. That's what I didn't say.
I thought you were talking about Liz Truss, because she was the one that...
I decided I'd try not to go too political, but I just wanted to write to the Prime Minister and say, shame on you. We've got too many problems at home, so we can't go to something which actually is about the whole world and affects all our futures. Shame on you.
Absolutely. And the thing is, I think the takeaway from that is you cannot rely on politicians to think in the long term, because that is, they don't do that. That's against their interest. It's against their self-interest. It's in the country's interest, but the country needs leaders who've got that vision, and unfortunately we don't have.
I don't know where we find, well, there are some people out there, and my politics isn't so good, but I had a similar experience in the fact that when I went to the beginning of my degree, which I dropped out of, I did we had a brilliant economics lecturer, so I was inspired to go along. I wasn't inspired once I was inspired by his initial talk. I wasn't inspired by anything else, but I came out of it having sat there through a whole module going, growth is wrong. Growth is not right. And that was when I was 19 or something. Growth doesn't work. And it's taken till now for people. Well, I know people have been working on it longer, but it's so important that we get that idea of growth out. And you hear it all the time on the news, all the time. And people, is your business growing? Are we growing? Growing to what? So we can explode,
Yeah, growing so that we earn more money for shareholders, which then spend it on stuff which is unsustainable that we end up putting in landfills. I mean, it's kind of
I think it's very worrying. I think that's a bedrock thing. And I'm not an economist. I want to talk to some on this, but it's a bedrock thinking, isn't it? That the shareholder thing is a real problem. That you have to make a decision for your shareholders that so that there's growth. Yeah, that's a real problem for sustainability, I think.
I think we should be evaluating businesses in a different way.
Yes, a different evaluation rather than just. And I think in a way that's what I want to do in these talks, is not to criticize the structure. It's very easy to criticize what's going wrong.
Absolutely.
But it's actually, how do we go forwards? Forget the criticism. We all know there are lots of problems. So what are the good ideas to go forward with?
I think that's essential.
Yeah.
I think, for example, okay, here's a sort of, a thought. So when I was 16, well, there's probably 17, 18, I heard about a publication which was called the Global 2000 Report to the President. And I'm not even sure which American president it was. And the idea was, I think it was 78 it came out. And I can remember saving my money and buying this. It was a white, thick white tome, written by the prominent scientists of the day, generally in the US. And it was how they thought the world would look in the year 2000. So I can remember getting it in 78. So I must have been 17, looking at it and being actually quite horrified about what was projected. And it was about deforestation, it was about rising CO2 levels, it was about the acidification of the ocean, it was about the fossil fuels, it was everything, and the decrease in biodiversity. And I can remember being horrified and putting the book down, thinking, hopefully it will never come to that. Anyway, we then, when we moved house about 15 years ago, or maybe more, 20 years ago, I came across this book again, and I opened it, and pretty well everything that they had predicted had come true. And what I was amazed at was just how adaptable we are, because when it happens incrementally, you accept it, and it becomes a norm. And it's this whole idea of shifting baselines. Your baseline is when you become aware of something, and that's where you then assess change from either up or down. And it was about how we come to, as humans, we're adaptable, we come to accepting. But I was absolutely horrified that I now accepted what my 17-year-old self found totally ghastly and very frightening. We have to act locally, and I think that's also where, because if you look at the big picture, you can get quite disheartened at times. Whereas if you look at local initiatives and local relationships and just people talking to people, I think that is where the energy and the sustainability has to come from.
Yes, no, brilliant. Well, thank you. Turn it off, or shall I just keep recording it and then I can? That's the thing.
Who knows what it's going to sound like, but
I know, it's great.
You need to do the editing, I think.
Not much though. Do you know what? Because podcasts are long, rambling, weird things.